Howdy, everybody. Um, you may have been asking yourself, when are we going to get that incredible part two of the discussion of issues in data quality that aren't actually data fraud? So the answer is today. Apologize, it's been a while to get this out, but I do hope you actually were able to listen to part one. I think that what Frank and Gina had to say, incredibly important, very insightful. They showed why they were true giants in the field, and I do appreciate their input. Their interviews and discussions went a bit long, so I thought I'd divide it into two. In this part, I want to take us through some of the issues. Data fraud is and will continue to be something that is important for the industry to go after and to understand and to attempt to find solutions for. That being said, if you've heard me talk at all in the last um, year or so, when I've used the phrase crisis of confidence, I make the assertion that there would still be a crisis of confidence if the issue of fraud disappeared. If we could solve every part of it, we'd still have a crisis of confidence. And so, the crisis of confidence is really about trust in the data, trust in what we're actually putting out, trust in the insights and that we're generating. People need this information to make decisions, whether it's public policy, business, or something else. And there really is kind of a questioning of the information that people are getting. So even if fraud were out of it, we'd still have a crisis of confidence. That doesn't mean it's not important. I don't want to minimize, and that's why we started this whole series with data fraud as sort of the first issue to tackle. But there are so many other issues that play into the crisis of confidence. That's why we're going through each of them in their um, respective frameworks. So here we're talking about just issues in data quality that aren't um, fraud related as I defined fraud in the first one. So that being said, you might be asking yourself, why do I say that even if fraud disappeared, when you were able to solve everything, AI or technology was able to eliminate fraud from happening, why would we still have a crisis of confidence? Well, there are multiple reasons for this. I'm currently conducting some research along with some just incredible folks, Todd Johnson, Steve Coffey, Gina Pingatore, and also participating are the folks over at Civic Science. We have access to a really unique set of data. We have thousands of questions asked over time, and they're asked effectively of three groups. The first group are those who take surveys on a regular basis for incentives online. Um, you might think of these as panelists or some other way that they're structurally taking surveys frequently for incentives. Now, when we looked at the panelists, we do actually break it down into those who are part of one panel or multiple panels. We actually, ironically, didn't find a difference. I expected there to be a difference. There's not really. The second group of people, and these are very, very interesting, I'll get into some of the facets as to why they're interesting, are people who used to take surveys on a regular basis for incentives, but no longer do. So you might think of these as lapsed panelists, those who just stopped doing it, people of that nature. The third group of folks are those who just have never done surveys regularly. We got them to answer these questions, but they're not regular survey takers. They don't belong to any panels. They don't, participate in rivers, things of that nature. So, a decade ago, the difference between, um, those who regularly took surveys and those who didn't was very small. It was 3%. That's sort of, it's not the same thing, but when you think of margin of error, 3% is sort of the boundaries that we think about as kind of a good survey. It's different. Don't get me wrong. I don't want comments on that, but it just tells you if this is error or it's just a difference. That's a good value. It's not too bad. However, in 2025, that value had ballooned up to 12%. And in certain cases, and I'll get into one coming up, it's much, much bigger than that. So, and I didn't include the full graph here, but if you actually just look over time, it's been growing. We're now at our peak, but it didn't just jump from 3%, i.e., was it 3%, 3%, 3%, and then 20, and then 12%. It's been actually actively growing over time. So whereas it's not error, we know that we're actually doing some work to sort of clarify, put this data up against some benchmarks and try and say what the error actually is. What we do know is those who participate in surveys, panels, things of that nature, the responses they're giving are starting to vary wildly from the responses that we're actually getting from those who don't participate in surveys. So let me give you one specific example. At Tenetic, we're interested in what local businesses are doing. We're interested in their customers. We're interested about behaviors around those local businesses. So in the set of questions that were analyzed for the previous slide and some of the work is actually a big part of what we're doing. We're actually asking a simple question. Which of these types of restaurant is your favorite restaurant? And it's things like fast food, national chains, fast casual, local restaurants, and the list is about 6 or 7 different categorizations. If somebody were to do a survey, who's most likely to have uh, paid for that survey? Well, it's not going to be your local restaurants. They're not making enough money to, do branding exercises or anything of that nature. So if you're a respondent and you're looking at a question, wondering if it's a qualification question, you're probably going to err on the side of the national brands. And in fact, that's what we actually find in this one. So what restaurant do you go to most? For those who regularly take surveys, the response is about 40%. For those who don't, it's just the third group. Now we're just comparing the first and the third group that I had mentioned. For those who don't, the answer is about 18%. So it's half of what the group is. More importantly, we're looking to profile these folks who go to local restaurants. So let's flip that. And remember, the local establishment is probably not conducting a survey. And so those who are heavy survey takers online, the result is only about 15% say that a local restaurant is their favorite restaurant. However, those who don't take surveys, they actually are up around 40%. I can't remember the exact number off the top of my head, but it's around 40%. So more than a 50% increase from, or actually 100% increase from where the heavy survey takers are. For the Tenetic business, it's more important to understand those people who are who actually like local restaurants. So I put this down to motivations and incentives. I think that's actually a fair way of looking at it. Now, let me bring back in that second group. So everything we've shown, this chart, the restaurant example, that was comparing the first and the third group, those who are currently taking surveys for incentives online and those who have never done that. The second group are those kind of in the middle. They used to do it and they didn't. So you might ask, where are they in the spectrum? Um, and again, all these groups look demographically similar. There's no real demographic differences across the groups. The group in the middle, they are extraordinarily close. They're not exactly where the third group is, those who've never taken surveys, but they're actually pretty close to that group. So that my hypothesis, and we haven't done the research to prove this out, so I want you to understand that as I say this, is there is learning involved in taking surveys. That we actually know. That's been established. But once you stop taking surveys for incentives and trying to qualify for as the surveys, that learning goes away. You start to act as if it's very similarly to those who are not taking, who haven't actually taken surveys in this manner. I find this very interesting. It's not a permanent effect. It's a learned behavior, and that learned behavior dissipates over time. So as I said, we're still doing work. We're going to actually investigate that a bit more through some proprietary work that we're looking at. But a very interesting set of data, a very interesting, um, uh, where are we at element of it. So now that we've kind of established, or at least I've established in my mind, that data quality. Oh, by the way, we removed any evidence of fraud that we could. So this is effectively without fraudulent behavior. Again, there are no incentives for this uh, endeavor. There are ways of looking into the data and detecting fraud. I can't say that we removed all of it, but I think we did actually a pretty good job of it. So the results are relatively pure. This is what happens when you get rid of fraud. Hence my phrase, if we were to be able to make it disappear, we'd still be in a crisis of confidence. The difference between what we think we know and what we know is extraordinary. So the question becomes, why are we seeing this growth, this change in data quality? I wanted to bring us back to sort of the history of online research. And all of this is not about online research, but I think it's actually illustrative. I'll get to telephone and face-to-face. I think their issues are a little bit more clear-cut that we're having here. Doesn't mean they're not as severe. And we are having data quality issues in both. But they're slightly different, and we'll actually address those when we talk about what I call selection bias. Okay, so we're going to start with a dive into online survey data quality, and we're going to do it from a historical perspective because it's fun. So for those of us who are around in the 1990s and that over to the mid 2000s, you remember the time when online survey research was considered a pariah. You know, I would go to the joint statistical meeting. I was always geeky, don't get me wrong. Ironically, at Harris, I managed both more traditional methodologies as well as online methodologies. So I was, sort of speaking about our telephone work, which was pristine and much better than anything that's happening today. But I'd also go and talk about online survey research and how we could actually do it in a respectable and representative manner. When I go to meetings, both academic and more industry-wide, some of the giants in the field really got apocalyptic and we're claiming that online research was destroying the industry. We understood where they were coming from, the basis for what telephone was doing, what face-to-face was often doing, had a real statistical grounding uh, in probability sampling. Now, I will argue, even by that time, samples that were being developed for telephone, face-to-face, anything that claimed it was a probability sample did not have the elements of a probability sample. We had moved well beyond the characteristics of it, but I at least understood where they were going from. But it was my job. It was George Trahanian's job. It was, many others in the field. It was our job to sort of defend online survey research, and we did it in a variety of ways. And I think we did a pretty good job. As a part of that, and this wasn't just us at Harris, it was, Gina and Frank. Frank was at Ipsos and Kantar. It was Bob Fossen, everyone who we've sort of had coming through. We conducted research. And, this is why I got into this industry. I was an academic at heart, and I lost my dream job. I was actually offered my dream job, but I couldn't, for reasons I won't get into. I couldn't take it. And so I got depressed. And what do you do when you're depressed? You join the market research industry because, hey, why not? But I was lucky. Harris was founded by, or it was really the Gordon S. Black Corporation when I joined. They had purchased Harris and they hadn't moved to the Harris name, Harris branding. But Gordon Black was a professor in the department that I was finishing my PhD in. And he really cared about representative research. And so he developed what I'll call a mini academic department in Harris. And there were three of us who sort of served as the pillars. You might recognize the names. There was myself, there's Renee Smith, another giant in the field, and there's Randy Thomas, a character if there ever was one, and kind of the best questionnaire design person in the industry that's been around for forever. And so we were given leeway to conduct research in how to design and execute online survey research so that it could be representative of the populations we were talking about. As I said, Frank Kelly did this. There was a whole litany of folks. There were honest to goodness research conferences at the time. But why do we do this? Well, we were a pariah and we were banding together. We were trying to prove that this thing called online survey research could produce good results, even when the naysayers just had incredible backgrounds behind them. And so we did a lot of things. But these other two elements are important to mention. I'll come back to them. The way we were actually conducting the research was mainly from panels, single source. We hadn't developed routers yet. That comes in the next section. And so it was your panel. Whenever we talk to various folks, it's interesting because we talk about what rules we had in place at the time. So I remember the debate over whether we would survey somebody more than once every 30 days. Now, I don't think there's a rule against surveying somebody once every 30 seconds. But you look back on those days and it was interesting. We were doing things really to hold the force. Sort of on a similar vein, we had control of our environments. We knew what the folks that we were sampling were doing. We know what they had done. We had information on their demographics. We kept all the data, and we were doing much more with it, strangely enough, than we are today. Okay, so I just want to go over, because I'm really going to emphasize that we need to get back to these things. What did we develop best practices for? Well, we had a new visual medium, and so we needed to understand how to most effectively do things in that medium. The mantra was, it's not just taking the wording from a telephone survey and pasting it on the screen. How can we do things better? And I'll give one example. um, in the brand space, um, brand recognition leads down the funnel to other behaviors and things you'd like. Um, the way it's asked typically is, there's an unaided and aided version of this that you just ask, tell us the brands, or if it's aided, which of these brands do you recognize on that level. We actually did research where, from the unaided side, if we just showed them the labels without the brand's name on it or something of that nature, they identified those. They were able to identify them. We found that that correlated more highly with desirable outcomes that we were trying to actually model further down the funnel. So here we did something. We took a visual medium and we figured out a better way of getting to the insight that we're trying to generate. Now, I bring this specific example up because I guarantee you 98% of what's going on today, 20 some years later, does not use this methodology. It reverts back to the fill in the brands that you know or recognize, or things of that nature. So we developed a best practice. It doesn't actually hold to it. Sorry, I guarantee you that the finding holds. People don't do it. We did a lot of best practices in question wording. How do we actually take things from an audio medium and put it in a visual medium? Randy Thomas was the king of this, but others along the way, figured out how do we position scales? How do we actually ask various types of questions? We did a lot of work into the respondent experience, particularly in the beginning. We needed to keep these folks happy. We needed to make sure they were answering the questions they thought they were answering. And so we did a lot of research into the respondent experience, including measuring what the experience was with the respondent. Now we're getting into MySpace. We did a lot of work on sampling designs and weighting practices. I'll talk about selection bias in a second. That's kind of what I was known for, is understanding what the difference is between somebody who might answer an online survey versus somebody who might answer a randomly an RDD telephone survey. Could we weight it to actually look the same, even though there still were some holes in the population when we started? We did a lot of work on incentive structures, and this is one area that Frank talked a lot about in the previous episode. Incentives aren't just monetary. I will tell you, monetary sort of comes in, but people have multiple dimensions on which they want to be incentivized. Information is one of those dimensions. Providing information back to respondents, which used to be a core principle, no longer is. How much money? And it wasn't just money for time, it was money for effort as well. We looked at incentives for time spent qualifying, even if you didn't qualify, things of that nature. So lots of work and best practices developed in incentive structures. And then we actually created better ways to generate insights. What are the models that we're actually building? Some of the choice-based models that we have today, they were around, but in a visual medium that can reach a lot of people, they're much more effective. And so we created better ways of generating insight. Okay. So I talked about motivations. We'll get into this a bit in selection bias, but the motivations for each mode, telephone and face-to-face versus online digital, are completely opposite. So, think about when you get a phone call from somebody you don't know, and that somebody might be a survey organization. Your reaction is most likely, none of these are universal, I don't want to take the survey. You're not getting incentivized for it, almost certainly. And sort of the timing when they're calling you and how they're reaching you is typically inconvenient. So things I'm going to do processes that I'm going to go through are going to be based on the fact that I probably don't want to take the survey. In the online and digital realm, I'm probably being incentivized for it. I want to be incentivized for it, and I want to take the survey. So the motivations that we have and kind of the key differentiators in the crisis of confidence are completely opposite of the two. So that's why I say telephone and face-to-face are a little bit easier to understand and actually get through. Because if you look at, and I know APOR has 812 different response rate definitions, but in the simplest of definitions, how much sample do I have to load to actually get a single interview? The amount of sample has increased just an incredible amount. If you don't think there's a selection bias in who you're actually getting on the telephone or face to face these days, face to face, particularly after COVID, you're kidding yourself. It really is significantly different than the population as a whole. So that's what needs to be solved. And I know that high quality telephone surveys, academic or governmental, say, well, we just need to follow up and call, 800 times to get the response. Ways people can screen their calls, I'm not sure that that's actually the case. But online and digital, and this is why we pay a little bit more attention to them, are facing a whole different set of constraints or issues. They want to take the survey. You just want to make sure that the responses that they're giving are accurate, that they are not satisfying or just completely losing engagement along the way. Okay, so this is kind of where I made my bread and butter. It's understanding the biases in the data. O and D are online and digital, T is telephone, F is face-to-face. So the way we always start off the model, we move well beyond this, but the way we always start off the model was saying, let's understand the biases in how somebody is coming into a survey. Well, the first bias is probably not a huge barrier at this point, but particularly in 2000 it was. But the person who's in the survey had to choose to be online. They had to choose to have part of the internet. And even more simply for telephone surveys, they had to choose to have a telephone line. Now, ironically, depending on how you're actually reaching people, that number has declined, whereas the online, people online has skyrocketed. At the time, it was choose to join a panel. Again, this is also really kind of conflated with other methodologies, other ways of engaging with surveys. But similarly, somebody on the telephone or doing a face-to-face had to choose to answer the phone or door. As you can see, this is actually a huge element of selection bias these days. You have caller ID, you have ways of just sending calls you don't want off into the ether. And I would say people are much more likely not to respond. They don't recognize the person calling, or they're not going to want to respond if you get Dynata or another vendor number showing up that they've identified. The next one is they have to choose to actually take the survey, and that's everyone involved. And then ironically, people used to think this is the same thing. It's not the same thing. You had to choose to finish the survey. You weren't dropping off in the middle. You weren't, and I would actually say honestly, finish the survey. You don't lose engagement along the way. So that's actually a pretty simple rubric breaking down how people take surveys. And I think a lot of people will go out there will go, duh. Well, here's the thing. This is how we develop something called propensity score weighting. What we know is based on each of the choices that somebody makes, those who complete surveys a particular survey may differ for those who do not answer the particular questions in very specific ways. And some of these specific ways may be demographically. Now, the solution everybody always has is, well, we'll just weight the data. Okay, go ahead and weight the data. What we know from this is that attitudinally and behaviorally, your weighting won't actually, if you're just weighting by age, gender, region of the country, your weighting won't really do anything to impact the biases that you actually have in the data. So what we did is we actually built selection bias models that included attitudinal and behavioral aspects. And we found certain dimensions were way more people differed on. And the incredible thing we found is when you corrected for these selection biases, and you could correct for them, you got answers that were dramatically similar. And where they differed, it made sense that they differed. You got actually better results online. So you would think many of these things still exist today. These biases are still prevalent. Not a soul actually uses this way of looking at information. Now, I have to give NORC a bit of credit. Ameripanel is doing something like this. They're already high quality, but they have started including something akin to a propensity score model in the work that they're actually doing. And their results are stellar. Okay. So that was the early, the early part of the industry. We worked really hard to try and overcome the pariah status. Well, it worked. People started, the naysayers never went away, but people started believing the data. I called multiple elections very accurately. And we don't talk about the one that I didn't call very accurately, but it had nothing to do with the mode. Others glommed on to those sorts of things, but also produced good results themselves. And so the result was people were willing to actually engage with online survey research, particularly since it was so much cheaper. If they could get data that was good enough, it was great. What that's resulted in is crazy growth in the 2010s. I mean, crazy growth. And what were the impact of these of growth? Well, put it simply, it was change. So you had a lot of new entrants into the industry. The one thing that's interesting is demand outpaced supply. We couldn't do we weren't doing this by this point. You couldn't do the 30-day exclusion anymore. You couldn't do the week exclusion. It started dropping and dropping and dropping. And that was because we needed the supply of respondents. I'm going to say something crazy. I don't think that the supply itself, the people doing survey research, has expanded over time, not dramatically. And I say this because we've done estimates of how many people take surveys. It's been relatively stable, I would actually say, since 2004. However, the amount of throughput has gone insane. So you've got the same number of people taking a heck of a lot more surveys at this point. So that means we needed new ways of optimizing sample. This is where things like routers, where aggregators came in, where just some incredible organizations developed. Folks like Cent and others. So you needed new ways of optimizing sample. We figured those out. We actually did this. And so if somebody did qualify for something, they weren't thrown into the ether. They then could be used in another survey. Now, we'll get to this in the later parts, but this does create some issues. And I think we're living with some of those issues today that we really didn't address head on. So there were also new organizational structures, new ways of looking at things from a corporate entity space. And then there's the famous year of mobile. And I put year in quotes. At one point, I counted up, and it was the year of mobile 8 separate years. in a row. Um, every year was, this is the year of mobile. Everyone saw the opportunity, everyone saw what was necessary. I think that it took a while for people to actually engage. The devices had to get better, I think. But finally, it did hit. And how we actually address surveys on a smaller screen, on a smaller device, it mattered. And it was much, it was another wrench into the industry. We worked through it. And then something else happened. Kind of the old guard moved out. And I call them the old guard, but these are also people with experience across all different modes of surveys. And I am now one of the old guard. I still exist, although not necessarily in the industry, although I'm adjacent. Um, I have experience in all forms of all modes of survey research. I've designed telephone, face to face. There was one of the most incredible surveys I was a part of. We actually had to do a geographic sampling of camp in Haiti after the devastating earthquakes that were there. We were able to design and push that through. So we had a lot of experience in what we were doing. That experience is waning. Now, there are people who've grown up in the online industry and are excellent. They just don't have other context to bring in necessarily because this experience is retiring effectively. So I got a few years until I retire, but that's the sentiment that's happening now. So that was the mid, uh, you know, up to the mid 2010s, crazy growth. So what happened? Well, I'm going to lump a lot of stuff that happened from the 2010s to now, as I, for one, welcome our robot overlords. And I mean this in the sense that tech took over. Res tech, you hear that phrase everywhere. I think Srinivasa and Patrick are doing some really good work in the space, sort of trying to organize it and have the way people think about it. But what's important is technology really came to the forefront in our industry. Now, I think this is a wonderful thing. I do think sometimes people think about the tech without thinking about the res part of it, the research part of it. New information sources came to be. Surveys started competing with a lot of other different types of information. There was the rise of private equity in the space. There's always been wheeling and dealing, but I would say that private equity has taken a lead role in most of the large companies in our space. And that's a wonderful thing. People are getting paid for what they're doing. We are gaining access to capital that we didn't have before, which allows us to continue to move on. There's some interesting aspects of this, however. I would say, with a few exceptions, and there are a few exceptions, CEOs of the major companies, they're not research people. You think about the George Gallups, the Todd Johnsons, the Gordon Blacks, the Humphrey Taylors, the Lou Harrises, of the world. They were research folks. They could just be in the methodology department and they would have succeeded beyond anybody's wildest dreams. They were also successful business people, very successful business people. They're not around anymore. And I do think, and I'll get into this in another episode, I think the fact that a lot of folks in the C-suite don't have a real connection to the research industry is harming the research industry. It doesn't have to. I don't think that the rise of private equity in and of itself is a bad thing. I think the consideration and how we look at it and how we staff for it is important. We also saw a lot of consolidation, companies, merging, so that competition was a bit less. Although there was also at the same point the rise of smaller companies. The barriers to entry were fewer. So you, on the one hand, had consolidation, particularly at the large end of the spectrum, but then you had all these new entrants coming in as well. So it was is the dichotomy. The middle folks, I think, got squeezed potentially. And then the democratization of surveys. I was a participant of this. I think it's wonderful. It allows people to conduct surveys in the way that they want to. It gives them better access. Again, a wonderful thing. Downside, not everybody has the experience. Not everybody has the chops to write a questionnaire. Everyone thinks they can, I will tell you. Um, not everybody can. So I do think the democratization of surveys has been a wonderful thing, but it's also created just surveys of really poor quality, double and triple barreled where people think they're just being efficient. Um, badly worded questions in this space. And then particularly in these days, AI. Um, we are, and this will actually be yet another episode of the crisis of confidence. We're at a precipice. AI is both a huge benefit to the industry and a huge threat to the industry. I think that I've already given one story and I'll give it yet again, but a large, well-known survey, folks got together an industry event and were talking about it. It's not cheap. And they were saying that, their senior executives, when it came to budget time, really kind of said, well, why can't we just ask ChatGPT? The answer is going to be good enough out of it. And let's get this cost off the books. With AI, we do have to justify our existence, and I think there are various ways for us to do that. But it is critical that we do so, or good enough is going to be good enough in this case. Okay. As I've said all along, none of this change is bad. Change has been, how the online survey research industry, in fact, how the telephone industry, folks were questioning the telephone industry when it came into being, and we went away from face to face for the most part. None of this change is bad. Excellent. But why is data quality declining? Well, there are lots of reasons for this. I've given you some of them as we've walked through this, but I'm going to kind of bring some more, and try and consolidate my thoughts on this. There are lots of reasons for this, but mainly we kind of treat respondents like crap. And that's led to just really declining data quality. Yeah, data quality. It's also led to folks who don't want to take surveys unless they can do a lot of them and they get paid for it. So I think we need to think differently in order to actually solve these things. But let me go through things. I've already kind of said this, but we now ignore expertise. We've lost a lot of the information we had. As I said, I gave you a list of best practices up front. As the industry became successful, and in particular as new entrants entered, kind of started ignoring the best practices. Or the way that I actually put it is everybody's an expert. Expertise isn't valued in the way that it should be. Along with that, we're ignoring best practices that we've established a long time ago. I think I've already talked, again, I'm assuming you guys are watching all of this and really enjoying the whole thing. But if you haven't, I have talked about some work that Frank Kelly and I did on incentives, where basically we found the way people react to incentives is the same way they've always reacted. When we started incentives, it was a strategic option. Everyone got something. We paid for, folks who didn't qualify for surveys. We paid, but we also did it very strategically. If it was a tough survey, we paid more. We didn't just base things on length of interview. I think now people have a grid. They know they have to do incentives, and they just, they look at the grid. Oh, this is a 5-minute survey. Which, by the way, 5 minutes in the survey, and I'll get to this in a second, is not 5 minutes of the respondent's time. They have most likely gone through multiple screeners in order to get into that survey. So they may have been in the environment or in an environment for a multiple of that times. So we just don't do the stuff we found um, worked. And again, our incentive work that we've done, and I think that Frank has continued to do in various forms or fashions, actually shows that incentives work. They work the way they're intended to. Now, that being said, with the grid approach, incentives are very low compared to effort, and they're not strategic, kind of what I was saying. And then we're boring the hell out of our respondents. The process is repetitive, boring, and creates expectations that are not met. If you're asking really bad questions, folks notice. If you are doing things in a way that, triple or double or triple barreled questions, for example, they don't know what you're actually asking. We don't do enough testing of our surveys to know that normal people won't react well to these sorts of things. And we also create expectations that are not met. And this now flows into the next one. Sometimes information flow is such that people get incentivized on the survey they are invited to or started, not on the one they actually took. So they might have been invited or started a survey that was going to be 5 minutes long, and that was what the incentives were based on. They might have ended up doing a 30-minute conjoint, and they're not necessarily getting more incentives. Not true everywhere, but the systems barely talk to each other. And we know today people are bouncing across various systems. So we need to have something that actually connects all the systems, whether you're staying in a closed system or you're actually going across the internet to various companies and various potential surveys. Designs, both visual and questions, are bad. I've gotten into that. Feedback from respondents doesn't result in change. And in fact, we rarely ask feedback from respondents. We used to actually have a continuum of questions that we would ask as we went forward. So in short, we kind of bring a lot of this on ourselves, and we end up blaming the respondent for it. Long grids, people end up random responding or straight lining. It's because we did it to them. We didn't break it up. We didn't do everything we should. We didn't test the survey in a way to make sure we were getting the information back that we wanted to get back. So I had the etc. here because I could have just kept going on and on and on. You guys don't want that. Okay, so that being said, it's not all the industry's fault. One thing that I think is key here is there's non-differentiation between who runs a good survey and who runs a bad survey, or who provides good sample and who provides bad sample. There's a lot of me tooing, and we experienced this when we created something at Harris with the propensity score weighting and some really cool sampling things. People just said, "Oh yeah, we can do that too," and they didn't. But in this day and age, I don't think buyers really differentiate or even have the signals to be able to differentiate between the different quality vendors. I have, I'll give one example on here. I'm not going to name names, but you guys will figure it out. There is one sample supplier who does a lot of good work and who does produce samples that, in my opinion, are decent, are pretty good. They do the things they say they're going to. It's not always perfect. They do produce some bad samples, but they actually do pretty well. They ended up PRing it in a way that was not effective. And so you got a lot of people just going, "Oh yeah, sure. Of course. Yeah, no." They didn't believe it. And that's the problem. If you do the work, the one thing I will say is you got to get paid for it. Creating a decent quality costs money. And again, you've got your knowledge panels and you've got your Amera panels that are really, really high quality. You don't need to be there, but there needs to be a spectrum across, and there's got to be a way of determining where you are on the spectrum. And if you have that spectrum, you can charge more once you're known for higher quality data. That's got to happen. Otherwise, the incentives to actually produce higher quality data just fly out the door. The other thing, and I put this on users of the information, is this mindset that good enough is good enough. And numbers on a page mean, are all that you need, irrespective of whether the numbers are accurate, representative, or not. I tell the story, really good researcher, at least my impression is this person is really good, was talking to me about something. It was weighted data that had been weighted up to the population. And I back calculated and was able to tell that they were talking to me about something in depth. They had done a huge analysis, something that probably was done on 3 respondents in total. But they had numbers on a page and they were able to tell a compelling story based on those 3 respondents. Now, I can't tell if they didn't do the back calculation to figure out it was only 3 respondents or they believe they had more. But that level of inquiry doesn't exist in certain parts of the world. Just having numbers is good enough. And then because of non-differentiation in the numbers of page, people are just searching for the cheapest option. People want quality, but they don't want to pay more for it. And my argument is, I've always done a calculation, and you can question the calculation, but you're going to pay max 10 to 20% more for higher quality data, but it's more. And so if you don't have enough information to differentiate across the company, the various options you have out there, and good enough, you just need to get a presentation out. You need to report some numbers. That's good enough. You are going to go for the cheapest option. That's the only dimension you have to really say anything. So I think that's another critical issue within the space. So the other thing is, I was talking to somebody about this the other day. I think this entire series is because I'm annoyed at people kind of throwing up their hands and saying, there's nothing that can be done. In this space, there's a ton that can be done. The first, and we'll talk about this further down the road, we need to provide mechanisms to show true differentiation that justify differential prices. We need to revert back to best practices. We need to create good surveys. People who are buying research need to pay for quality. And again, doesn't mean go hog wild and pay for, the top quality you ever possibly can get, but understand there is bad stuff out there and don't pay for that. You're gonna have to pay a little more, but pay for that. Develop a common IT infrastructure for information sharing across survey platforms and use it. This would allow us to know more about the experiences our respondents are having, will allow us to know more about what incentives should be paid and to pay the right incentives. And it would just allow a lot of the important work that needs to get done to get done. You heard this in the first, and this is really the second episode. Use the tools for data fraud that exist. And then this one I'm passionate about. I've been lucky in that I've been brought into the executive leadership teams of the companies that I've been a part of since I became an executive. I think more folks need to do that. Install a research expert in charge of quality at the ELT level. And this isn't just have a senior person. This is have a senior person in the room where the key decisions are being made. You'll hear me talk about this again and again and again. Ironically, the last time I did a podcast where I talked about this, I actually named a name of somebody who would be great. And the company that he worked for thought he'd been put up to it, and he actually got into some trouble for it. I feel passionately that person would have been fantastic. He's no longer at the company, not because of this. But the fact that that was the response is problematic. The if you're a research company in the research world and you do not have a research expert or a person in charge of quality on the ELT, I would really question why anybody buys from you. And I know that's a harsh statement, but your commitment to what you're trying to produce, the insights you're trying to generate, the sample you're trying to provide is not evident in these cases. I think there's got to be. I think just having a senior person doesn't work because real decisions are made in the room at the ELT level, and it's sort of revenue decisions are short term, quality decisions are long term, and the way that I've worked it is I've made the argument. I don't always win the argument, but you can't ignore the data quality component of it when I'm actually in the meeting itself. And it's worked out well because when we have done things that I would judge as suboptimal for revenue reasons, I'm able to bring it up the next time we actually discuss it. And decisions based on quality, based on getting the best product out there, really require somebody to be in the room on all of this. So again, I think the big one here is revert to best practices. And yeah, actually all of these are big. I was about to say provide mechanisms for true differentiation is huge. But I'm passionate about get the research experts. And there are some of us out there who, I do have an MBA from the University of Chicago as well as my academic work. It helps me in these situations. I think, though, that there are some of us out there, not all the research experts can be that. We are a bit quirky as a group, and some won't know where to compromise. But we're out there, and I think it's imperative that we are part of the decision-making process. So that's it. Next time, we're talking about AI, everyone's favorite topic. I'm not going to promise the timing just because these have gotten longer and longer in between them. I am now back to my consulting practice, so I have more time to do this. So once I line up the guests, I have several in mind. We'll get the next episode out as quickly as possible. Thank you for joining, and I'm looking forward to having the next conversation with you. Okay, take care, everybody.